China has lashed out at Japan over its annual defense review. For the first time, Tokyo has raised the alert over growing military tensions around Taiwan.
这段时间，日方接二连三拿中国说事儿，粗暴干涉中国内政，无理指责中方正常的国防建设和军事活动，对中方正当的海洋活动说三道四，渲染所谓中国威胁，这是极其错误和不负责任的。中方对此强烈不满，坚决反对。
Tokyo has noted that Beijing has been intensifying military activities around Taiwan. It says stabilising the situation is important for Japan's security, as well as regional stability. The defence review also points to China as Japan's main national security concern. Now, it warns that economic and technological tensions between Beijing and Washington could threaten regional peace and stability. For the first time, there's also a new section on threats posed by climate change. The paper says that it could lead to an increase in competition for land and resources. It adds that disasters linked to global warming could also stretch military capabilities. For a closer look, we're joined by Raffaello Pantucci from Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Mr. Pantucci, why is Japan singling out the issue of Taiwan now?
I think the reason is, quite frankly, because of Japan's relationship with the United States. I think Japan, like the rest of us, has noticed that the relations between Washington and Beijing have become much more tense. And within that context, Taiwan is, a perfect flashpoint. If we look at the white paper, you can see in the cover note by the defense minister, he specifically refers to the United States as our only ally. So within that context, you can see that the United States is confronting China in an increasingly, tense fashion. And Taiwan offers itself as a place for the confrontation to really develop into a hot war. It's very close to Japan. It's clearly something that Japan has already expressed interest in doing something about defending or supporting Taiwan. So, focusing on Taiwan like this in the defense paper is not very surprising within the context of the broader security dynamics that we see playing out in East Asia.
And in what other ways is China Japan's main national security concern?
I mean, the Japanese have long had a sort of tense relationship with China. I mean, if we go back further in history, you can see actually the two of them had a fairly productive relationship. If you go back to the sort of 90s, Japan was actually trying to help sort of China come out into the world and, grow into a sort of bigger power. But sort of in the mid-2000s, we started to see that relationship turn and tensions started to develop and history started to weigh into it. And we saw what was a fairly sort of productive relationship between the two really turn sour. And ever since then, it's only become more tense, where Japan becomes, in some cases, really a focus for Chinese anger. China sees really the United States as its principal and only adversary on the world stage, but it sees everyone else through the lens of its relationship with the United States. And so within that context, if it looks around the sort of East Asian periphery, Japan is the strongest power in its neighborhood, and it's the one that has a very close relationship with the United States. So it becomes a focus in some ways for this large attention when China realizes that it can only go so far in its relations with the United States. And this the Japanese can see. And as a result, we can see Tokyo recognizing that, its principal security relationship is with the United States. And so it has to really start upping its game to ensure that it is able to bring something to this confrontation in order to, continue to, stay closely allied with the United States. The other element of this I would add for Japan is the complexity of its economic relationship with Beijing. Of course, Japan has a very strong economic relationship with China, which it has to find a way of balancing.
So on that point of relationships, Mr. Pantucci, can Japan then afford to align itself with the United States, who's made clear that Japan is an ally, against China?
Well, it's very complicated because on the one hand, Japan doesn't really have a choice within this context. The United States is its most significant ally and it needs to have a strong relationship with them. So it needs to support the United States to the hilt. In part, also, it needs to strike a balance against the fact that Japan actually has a very close relationship with Russia. And that is something that causes huge complications with the United States. So in a way, what we can often see with the relationship with with the sort of confrontation with China, especially in recent years when we've seen relations between Beijing and Washington really go into a very dark spot. You know, in order to sort of compensate for the fact that Japan hasn't got the same sort of a tense relationship with Moscow that the United States does, that it really pushes itself forwards in the relationship against Beijing. And so for Japan, it's really a question of how do you continue to do that. On the other hand, on the economic side of the coin, which is always the part that Japan worries might suddenly come under scrutiny or with focus focus of sort of Chinese anger. There's a degree to which Beijing needs the economic relationship as well. And there's a degree to which Beijing also wants to maintain some sort of a functional relationship with Japan because it is a sort of important economic actor that sits in its backyard. So it's a very delicate dance for Tokyo, but it's very clear in this document that they're saying that, you know, the United States is our principal ally at the moment and we're focused on them in defense terms more than we're focused on Beijing.
Could you elaborate a bit more on the economic side of things that you mentioned? The white paper, as you alluded to, also mentions that, as well as technological tensions between the US and China. Now, how that sort of will Japan be affected by these things?
It's very difficult there because, of course, in economic terms, you know, Japan has been a major investor to China for a very long time. And there's a lot of Chinese companies that make huge amounts of money, frankly, in the giant Chinese market. There's also a lot of Japanese technology that, you know, the Chinese want access to and have got access to. And there's lots of sort of strong economic relationships and human relationships that go sort of back and forth between Japan and China. So there's this very strong sort of economic fabric that ties the two of them together. And what we've seen in the past, I don't know, a few years, really, it started under the Trump administration, sort of continued under Biden, is the fact that this economic relationship between the United States and China has increasingly come under focus. And we can see the discourse in Washington is increasingly of decoupling and cutting relations. And in particular, this is focused in the technology realm, where there's a sense in Washington that, you know, China is using its technological prowess to sort of create an alternative sphere of influence around the world, which really challenges something fundamental in the United States global posture. And technology is a huge part of that. And we can see within the technology space, the discussion is around decoupling. The idea being that actually this idea of economic interlinkage can hold in some domains, but not in the technological one. And this is complicated for Japan. Japan is a major technology power and a major technology exporter. And not only is it dependent on selling its stuff around the world, it's also dependent on tools and technology from China at the sort of lower end of the spectrum, which it uses or its companies use around the world. So there's a very close relationship there. And the concern, I think, from a Japanese perspective is, on the one hand, the fears of sort of cyber penetration and technological, you know, theft or IP theft, which might come from China. But on the other hand, the fact is that if the world was to decouple and you were to have two sort of very different economic spheres around technology, one that's sort of focused on the Chinese world and its allies, and the other that's focused on the United States and its allies, Japan would probably come in that American bracket, but it would probably lose a lot in trying to sever all those links with China. And that is a major economic concern to Japan.
Mr. Pantucci, thank you very much for your thoughts this evening. That was Raffaello Pantucci from S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies.